Good evening to our viewers here in Denmark, and thank you for being with us. And especially good evening to you, Caroline Fourest, who's with us from Paris. Thank you so very much for taking your time.
No, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
You've been a role model for us for some time for your fighting for free speech and for your engaging in difficult debates. And I think also for showing that being on the left means also fighting against leftist dogmas. That is where the fight very often starts if you want to have some legitimacy. And you've invested a lot in your fights, both morally but also intellectually. So I'm very happy to get the chance to talk to you. And I've read your book first. I read it in French, Génération Offensée, and then I read it in Danish when it came out. And I want to recommend it to French as well as Danish viewers. You know, a few years ago, I started wondering about a dramatic change in the conception of freedom among young people. And you're born in 75. I'm born in 74. So I grew up with this soixante-huitard background. They were the horizon. I knew that they were flawed. Not everything they did was right, but I shared their conception of freedom. That my mother, growing up in the countryside, coming to the university, her struggle for freedom would also be the struggle for my wife, who's a refugee from Iran's freedom, and the freedom for them to express themselves would be the freedom for all others to express themselves. And if someone wanted to limit one person's freedom, it would be the limitation for everyone. So our conception of freedom was fairly simple, that we wanted to express ourselves and we were against prohibitions. And then I noticed that the young people, the next generations, they had a different conception of freedom, that they wanted not to be free to express themselves, but more to be free from other people expressing themselves. That another kind of freedom that means protecting from the freedom of others. And the reason why I mentioned that is not to talk about myself. It's because it's the observation that starts your book. So how did you notice this difference between the generations' conceptions of freedom?
I noticed it because I observed many demands for censorship coming from leftists and young leftists. And I was so used to observe censorship coming from the right-wing fundamentalists. I remember the time when Madonna, for example, was doing a musical clip like a prayer where she's kissing a black Christ. It was a huge polemic. It was absolutely scandalous, a blasphemy. But at that time, it was so fashionable to be offending to someone else, especially the conservative, especially the Catholic Church. And obviously, it works well for Madonna because she sold many records after that. But the times have changed, obviously, because today, many young artists, if they are under any kind of polemic, even if a small one, just a few furious tweets, they immediately apologize. And for ridiculous purposes, really ridiculous purposes. Remember, I don't know, the polemic about Pharrell Williams or Cathy Del Peri for having putting pictures of themselves with what you call dreadlocks. And suddenly they've been accused of cultural appropriation. Pharrell Williams, it was an Amerindian way of being kind of hat that he had for a cover. I think it was for Vogue, something like this. And he had to, all of these musicians and artists are strongly advised by their team, especially their communication team from their labels, to apologize like if they did a crime, something absolutely unforgivable. So this is the time we're living with. And coming, as you said, coming from a generation who fought for both, first against discrimination, because myself, I'm coming from the fight against homophobia, I won with many others the equality for all to be free to marry a woman. And in the same times, coming from Charlie Hebdo as a journalist, I had to fight also for freedom of speech. So I think I was exactly in the corner at this intersection to observe that suddenly freedom of speech and equality were not fights we can lead together, but suddenly they were opposed to themselves by the young generation, and it disturbed me strongly. And I wanted to clarify some of these misunderstandings to preserve this possibility to fight both for equality and freedom of speech, of course.
When the younger generations, when they shock me, I always ask myself, is it me that is getting old? Or, you know, you always think that the young people, they see something that are blind spots to us, and they have experiences of unfreedom, of suffering that maybe I don't see. So I tend to prohibit myself from judging them too fast. And I was thinking, well, they're investigating a reality that I grew up with, and maybe they have some experiences that I don't have. So at first, I'm very cautious. How did you approach this challenge of being the older generation, teaching the young generation, this is freedom, kids?
Being since so many years too young for everything, a too young woman to be correctly paid first, a too young woman to have many possibilities, I suddenly felt, yes, on the other camp, on the other side of the frontier, suddenly I was too old to understand those kind of hungers. Honestly, there is a part of it, yes. Partly it's only a question of generation. And the new generation is maybe because they suffered a little bit less than us. I'm sorry to say that, but it's true. They suffered a little bit less than us. They are not born like me, for example, in a world where they were not free to marry who they want. I think homophobia was absolutely more vicious 20 years ago than today. So now they are attacking the end of this process, which sometimes to me seems to be a little bit too sophisticated. I mean, I love, for example, the fact that now we are fighting against micro offending. How can you say that in English? Micro vexation. The thing that is not so big, it's not a real discrimination, it's not someone that is really racist or homophobic or sexist, it's just a slightly viciously sentence who seems to be nice, but in fact, if you really look at it, it's not so nice. There is still some stereotypes in it. I admit, of course, this work needs to be done, and it's cool that the new generation is absolutely careful and vigilant about that too. My only problem starts where they react in front of these good feelings who are sometimes clumsy and not absolutely empty of old prejudices. They are reacting like if it is a real big, horrible, racist or homophobic or sexist comments with the intention of actually humiliating someone or discriminating someone. Then I have a problem because the reaction is a little bit too much. Yeah. And it gives the feelings sometimes, it's helping actually, I think it's helping the real racists, the real homophobes, the real sexist. If you are overreacting in a way, like, for example, if you put on the same level a rapist and a guy who is clumsy, a predator and someone who is just, okay, he's too drunk and he says stupid things. You cannot react the same way, or you consider that you are victim in the same way. And that's not fair, I think. And that's not effective, more than fair. It's not effective to defend actually equality. So I admit perfectly that there is a lot of work to finish, that it's absolutely needed that the new generation are, again, very careful and very vigilant about that. I'm just asking in my book for many a proportionality, let's say, more complexity. And again, respecting that if someone says something you disagree with, it's not necessarily offending. It's maybe just something you disagree with.
And something, when I first read your book in French, I really enjoyed it. I thought there were so many observations and there was a temper in the book that I really liked. but I was doubtful myself, how big of a problem is this? You know, how big of a problem is that, you know, I mean, the upper classes, they always have weird fights about symbols and rituals, you know. I'm not very offended about what happens in the British royal family, or you know, and I'm not royal, you know, that someone is angry about what Pharrell Williams does with his hair, you know. And I can see it's central in a lot of culture, especially American culture, and we're importing their moral imperialism. But how deep is the problem? Why is this problem big enough for you to write this book against it?
We had the same conversation in France when the book came out. Many journalists say, you're absolutely right. It's really very interesting, but really, is it a real phenomenon, or we are talking about a bunch of nuts on Twitter? The fact is that the bunch of nuts is a huge crowd. And they are, especially among the young elite of the world, especially, of course, it started all with the students in American universities. They are the first and the most active in this kind of over disproportionate reactions, using all their cultural power to cancel anyone they disagree with, pretending that they have been offended by something they confuse with racism and sexism and homophobia, who are very big, serious problems and questions that cannot be confused with just, again, an old classical book that should be read, even if you have to put it in a specific context. But now they are asking for trigger warnings, to not be shocked, to not be offended. And now they are even asking in many, many important universities, we're talking about Yale, we are talking about Berkeley, we're talking about all the Ivy League in the USA. So we are talking actually about the elite of the world. That is, it has been educated now since almost 20 years in this culture of counseling plays, books, discussion to feel safe. This is their big, big, big notion. I want to feel safe. Recently, last week, for example, some students in the USA asked to forbid the play of Jean-Paul Sartre, No Exit, because they felt unsafe. Unsafe because the book is about people confined, yes, okay. And also because the character of a woman dislike some of the readers. I'm not even sure that the people who protested did read the play, actually, but they tried to cancel it instead of, or not going to see the play, or just commenting it afterward. That mentality is honestly now very, very, very common inside the most prestigious university in the USA. And as you said, we are importing their words, this mentality, their teachings. Many activists in Europe coming from the identitarian left that I do not confuse with the universalist left, who want to continue to fight against real stuff, let's say. Real stuff, not Pharrell Williams and his hairs, but really, I mean, social inequalities and real sexism and real racism. We are very more and more intimidated by this radical identitarian left copying the American one. And because they are using the accusation of being racist or being even white supremacist or being sometimes from fascist almost, just if you defend, for example, a secularist, universalist feminism. So it's becoming quite annoying, to say it less. And if we don't have this debate, if we do not clarify our ideas about where is the line between hate speech and free speech, and what is part of being leftist and what is becoming a sectarian way of being intolerant and not leftist anymore, I think the left can die, including in Europe. The left can die from it, honestly.
And I think it's a very important point in your book that this is actually a job that the left must take on itself. That this criticism of this relativism and this tribalism that is inherent in this cultural critique, which I agree with you, is extremely powerful, but it's a power alliance that we're not used to dealing with. It's Nike, it's Silicon Valley. It's part of the critical race theory of the White House, and it's Wall Street. So, and it's the elite universities. It's Netflix. It's, you know, so it's a very, very, I think it's a very powerful position. And again, when I was growing up, the liberal culture of America was a counterculture. You know, we got Bob Dylan from there. So, you know, we got all their power.
Freedom from there.
Yes, exactly. And we got the pictures of freedom. But this is kind of a new cultural form of power that we're seeing. How should we understand this form of power?
No, you are absolutely right. It's a very, very strong power, cultural power, coming from the Silicon Valley and all the cultural networks you described. And they have the power to control our representation, the way we see the world. It's coming from very rich people, actually, that are using sometimes the identity politics to appear as the victims and avoid the conversation about what do we do about correcting inequalities. And I think it's honestly part of what killed, or not killed, because fortunately Joe Biden won this election, but it was short. It was short after a pandemic where Donald Trump explained basically that we should experiment to take bleach to cure ourselves. And still, Joe Biden won really, really shortly after that. And I'm not even sure that the next time the USA won't elect worse than Trump, if it does exist. So I think the left should really address this issue and should ask herself, do we want to play that game, knowing that at the end, if we give the impression that being leftist today is, again, not defending freedom anymore, we let the right wing having this flag, and we are just appearing as people who cannot stand the fact that some singers are being inspired by other culture, and that the fact we should have only meetings white and not white separated. So we should reinstall segregation, for example, inside the university, which is one of the debates we're having right now in France. So if being the left is to be pro-veil, pro-segregation, and pro-censorship, but it's not so surprising that the right wing is rising in Europe too, as it rised in the USA. I mean, you have to understand, it's part of my big concern, and it's part of the reason why I wrote this book. I don't want a Donald Trump in Europe, not in Western Europe. We have it already in Eastern Europe, but can we avoid it in Western Europe? To avoid that populism, I think the left has a big role to play. And one of it is to avoid this sectarian, ridiculous identitarian left, and to get back with the fight for both equality and freedom. Because again, I insist, every time in the history, every time the left is abandoning the flag of the freedom, the right wing, and worse than that, is rising.
I think there's something that's, I agree with you, but I think there's something that's, to me, is quite complicated, is that there is this new sensitivity, and we get some, in my view, real progressive movements out of it. For instance, if you say the Me Too movement, this is not about saying this is not allowed. This is about showing something that was never acceptable and revealing it to, well, this happened. This was unacceptable. Sure. So that, to me, that is an extension of the civil rights movement. For something that was done in secret is shown to the world, and it's universal. It's the same for all. We won't accept that. So out of the Me Too movement, you see real progress being made. And interestingly enough, I think when you see real systemic change, it comes from the feminism part of it. It's the universalism of the Me Too movement. But the Me Too movement also comes with a certain sensitivity that borders to identity politics in other areas, where you say, well, it's not just that Harvey Weinstein was a creep, he did this and that. It's also that, you know, these stories about Andrew Cuomo, that he touched someone in the wrong way. So my question to you is, how should we distinguish what's the real historic leftist fight, where I see some progress being made in America, from what is a new and dangerous sensitivity, which is basically intolerance?
Of course, it's difficult. Of course, it's difficult because, as you said, the Me Too movement most of it, it's a huge revolution. It's a fantastic revolution. It's what, as a feminist, we were expecting since decades. I mean, and it's freedom. It's freedom of speech. Freedom of speech to say, you're wrong. You've been too far. You humiliated me. You raped me. And the fact that the shame is not anymore on the shoulders of the victim, but now it's finally on the shoulders of the rapist, is absolutely progress we can compare to the civil rights movement. The beginning of what could be an overreaction is where feminism is not anymore used, and it's the first years of that. I mean, in history of feminism has always been a counterpower. And being feminist was something was really, you needed to be brave to say you were feminist, because, and I'm speaking from a generation who did, I mean, I paid for that. We knew that at the moment we said we were feminist, we were starting to have problems, enemies, to be paid less, because honestly, also many of the people who are employees, your boss doesn't like to have a feminist as an employee. So we paid the price to know that being feminist needed a certain guts, let's say that. When the feminism started to be so mainstream as it is today, which is a cool thing, again, that's part of the victory, that's the part of what we want with the revolution. But at that moment, the counterpower started to become a power that you can abuse also. Mm-hmm. It can be used by people who have non-feminist intention. It can be used with people who are using it as a tool in their game for political reason, for example. It can be used by opportunists who are just seeking for revenge and not anymore for equality. So we're entering in a new area where feminism must be wise, not only revolutionary, but also wise enough to not be instrumentalized. And again, yes, we are joining the area where identity politik simplifies everything. Honestly, it did simplify the anti-racist movement, and it's now starting to also simplify too much the feminist cause. For example, we have a real big problem with what we call the intersectionist feminism. Yes. Which at the beginning was a fantastic idea that honestly every feminist shared, including in the 70s. I was too young for that, but my sisters in arms who did the free liberation movement told me, but Caroline, in the 70s, we were all internationalists. We were fighting for the civil rights movement. We were coming back from the USA where we were activists there. We were fighting for the refugees, the migrants. It was part of the feminist movement, of course. So the intersection has always been there. But now there is a tendency of young anti-racist activists that joined the feminist movement as a second cause. And they started to explain that the feminist movement was just a bunch of white old women, and that they needed now to be careful if they are, for example, denouncing a rapist. They have to pay attention if it is a rapist part of the white majority or if it is part of the minority. Because if it is part of the minority, denouncing the rape can be interpreted as something that is helping the racists. It's almost never said so clearly than that. But the intimidation in the name of the anti-racist cause is still very heavy on the shoulder of some feminists today, in the sense that you cannot consider, like in the past, that a rapist is a rapist. We don't care which origin, which religion is it from. We don't care. If the important is to denounce the rape, is to denounce what he has done as a man abusing his power. This complexity is becoming more and more difficult because, again, it's complex to explain, but the identitarian approach has won some territories inside the anti-racist movement that became more identitarian than really for equality. That mean more, I'm complaining in the name of my identity, and this is why you're going to give me something in return. That's the victimhood tendency of the world. Yes. And then it transformed the anti-racism in something which is sometimes very counter-performative, and sometimes also unfair, and sometimes even at the limit of being racist with some people of the majority. And that also had an impact on the feminist movement now. So this is why it has this tendency of touching and dividing, fracturing the whole left.
And I think there's an interesting point in what you're saying is that it's often been said that people who are against identity politics, they say, well, they read too much Michel Foucault in the American universities. It's all the French postmodernists and deconstruction, and they couldn't digest it in America. So this is what came out. But actually, one central point of Foucault is that the minority is not just the minority, that there's no, it's not like a few people in society have the power and some people are always the victims. And it's like at the core of the campus radicalism of America is that some people are always with victims and other people are, and they are always minorities, whereas others are always in power and they would always be the majorities, which is so ridiculously wrong. I mean, obviously, if you're in the university and if you're in the liberal arts part of the university here in Copenhagen and you're against gay marriage, you're definitely a minority. You will be cancelled. If you're in favor of gay marriage in the small parts of the rural Denmark where my family comes from, then you're definitely in the minority. I mean, the positions change wherever you are. So you can't just say, well, I am defending, like, say, Black people. They will always be a minority. You have to look at the complexes of power that they interact with. And I think that's a core problem for identity politics, this fixed hierarchies.
Absolutely.
Which they're absolutely at odds with the society that we're in. They're like the society of Louis XIV.
And they are the contrary of the society we were expecting and wishing, fighting against racism. Because fighting against racism at the beginning, if we follow all the thinker of it, is to denounce first the notion of race that now has been reestablished by some of the identitarian activists that are claiming, of course, we believe that races are social constructions, but still we believe in it. And once you are rehabilitating this word in Europe, after the whole history we've been through in the name of race, you're done, you're lost. The extreme right will win the game. Plus, as you said, it's a vision of the identities that are settled for once for all.
Exactly.
You're born privileged, you're born on the wrong side, or you're born on the minority side. These do not exist in the real world because of the complexity of interaction. You can be straight and being white and being poor, really poor, at a point where you're not privileged. You can be Black and a straight man and being very rich, and you can be someone who is a game changer in a position of being really privileged, actually. And considering that, no matter if you're rich or poor, no matter of your ideas, no matter if you are a Black Lives Matter activist or if you are, at the contrary, a Ku Klux Klan activist, what matters is the color of your skin. This simplicity, this stupidity, I'm sorry to say that, because it's at a point where, again, even the stupidest extreme right of today is the only last one to think this way, honestly, with this essentialist mentality. Of course, the left find other words to craft it in a more acceptable way. You quoted the French theory. My theory is just mine about the French theory, is that already at the beginning, Michel Foucault was more than a real complete approach about the complexity of the world. Michel Foucault especially defended the subversity of the minority, which in the context of his time was a very important, interesting, effective, necessary. He made some mistake. He supported Khomeini as a fantastic anti-imperialist leader. Also, Khomeini was supposed to lead the revolution and the revolution of the minorities. We know now the end of history, and he apologized for that. But once some American university American thinker, took the simplicity of Michel Foucault and put it in a very more even simplest way, and apply it in a different context where, again, minorities are not only described considering the power game, but considering just the identity of them, their color of their skin or their gender, etc., etc. Then at the end, again, I think the stupidest right-wing movement could have arrived to the same conclusion. So it was not necessary to quote the Foucault, French theory, and all of that to say, finally, races, the race does exist. If you are white or black, you are different. And you should not, by the way, be together to discuss about racism. You should be separated. Okay, to arrive to this conclusion, I think, honestly, that Donald Trump and his fellow Proud Boys are quite happy to hear it. Really, really happy to hear it.
I think this is something that we became painfully aware of in Denmark during the caricature crisis, because on the left, I think most of us on the left were against the caricatures when they first came out, because they came out in a right-wing newspaper that never did anything for freedom of immigrants or freedom of Muslims. And in our perception, is on the left, I think it's the general perception. I changed my mind radically on this, but we saw it at the time like this was weaponized by the majority culture to tyrannize the minority cultures. But, you know, then gradually we realized that there were actually minorities in the minority, and they were being tyrannized by their fathers would say, well, Muhammad is a holy prophet, let's kill everyone who depict him. And then after that, we had Egypt against us. And then Egypt was the majority, and we were the minority. Denmark was the minority. So I think to a certain extent, it's been a very painful process for us with the caricatures. But I think we actually learned that you cannot base your normative critique on who is at a certain point the minority. You must have some universal principles saying, well, he's a religious authority. If we cannot criticize a religious authority, we cannot be a free society, no matter who it is. But I'm bringing it to this caricature issue because I want to ask you something. Because you were, as you said before, part of Charlie Hebdo, and you've been very courageous, more courageous than we have here. And I think we're here at the Danish media, and especially here at Information, because, you know, we were born out of the resistance movement during the Second World War. People risked their lives for 5 years to make this workplace where we now go to work with computers and retirement funds, and we have all our welfare from that. So we owe our workplace to someone who fought with their lives. And we find it very difficult how to deal with these caricatures, because on the one hand, we should definitely print them. I mean, it's not like we shouldn't offend anyone. You know, you can't make newspapers on that principle. So, but on the other hand, we have this security issue, and we've come to this conclusion. We are saying, well, we're too afraid to print them. And if we print the caricatures, we have the threats here. The security apparatus could kill this newspaper. I mean, we can't afford the security. And this is, I think this position breeds its own cynicism. At least we've been honest. We don't print the caricatures because we're too afraid. We would do it if we didn't have the courage. What is your reflection on this delicate position? Because you invested more in it than we did.
First, it moved me to hear you that you changed your mind, because I remember very well the moment of the beginnings of the Cartoons Affair. I went to Copenhagen. I went to interview many members of the Jyllands-Posten for Charlie Hebdo. And at that time, I noticed that, for example, the Politiken and the left newspaper were strongly, strongly against it, and saw it only first as something coming from a right-wing newspaper and being weaponized against a minority. And my perception at the time was that, again, inside the Muslim community, if you can say so, it's not a question of the number. Of course, the fanatics are a minority, but the fanatics are dominant and they're aggressive and they're violent. and they are dangerous for the other ones. So you cannot consider that, for example, mocking the taboo of the fundamentalist is humiliating a minority. No, it's helping actually the free minds of a culture to have some allies against the fanatics. And if they are alone without no access to the mainstream press, then don't expect them to win. But more than that, for us, as a Charlie Hebdo point of view, there were a question of freedom of press, more than that, because as a satirical newspaper, we draw, and especially my talented, genius friends, the cartoonists, many of them are dead now in the Charlie Hebdo terrorist attack. And I have to tell you, the first time I mentioned the Danish newspaper to my friends of Charlie Hebdo, it was far before the real beginning of the international polemic. It was when it was just a national polemic, because a friend of mine, Mehdi Mozaffari, from Iranian origin.
A friend of mine too.
You see?
Yes.
Actually, it's Mehdi who did show me the drawings the first time. We were in a cafe in Paris and he told me, Caroline, a Danish newspaper, I have no idea, I had no idea what the Jyllands-Posten was. He just told me a Danish newspaper shown those cartoons to fight against auto-censorship, because it's impossible today to have, a cartoon book about the life of Mohammed without being afraid. So they decided to publish those cartoons. What do you think? Charlie Hebdo is ready to publish them. I said, Mehdi, you know, I know my friends, I know the cartoonists of Charlie Hebdo, they're very proud of their work. They will tell me that their drawings are far better than that, which is exactly almost what happened. But a few weeks after that, maybe a few months after that, the international polemic started with, we know now, the contribution of a very radical imam went to find the Islamic League, went to found the many organizations who joined this polemic only for, again, political games, political reason, Iran on one side, Syria on one other side. And then we started to see those crowd burning Danish flag in the streets. And some journalists in France started to call saying, Charlie Hebdo, what are you doing about those cartoons that are infuriating the world? Are you going to show them? We had a meeting about that. And the morning at the meeting in Charlie Hebdo, another French newspaper would try to show those cartoons to explain the polemic, just to do its job as a journalist, to show, okay, there is people who want to kill all the Danish citizens. You want to know why? For this, just for simple drawings. This is pure, simple information. So for us, the decision was simple. Of course, we're not going to say only the Danish citizens should die and should face these death threats and endure that, because no, we are journalists. We are a satirical newspaper laughing about all the fundamentalists all the time, especially the Christian one. Of course, we're going to show those drawings. We are going to explain what we do think about it. And we are going to add our own drawings, which will be anti-racist and anti-fundamentalist in the same times. And you know what went after that? We started to, we were very, very conscious that it could cost some lives among us. The police protection started for most of us. Our life changed completely, but we never regret it. I can say so. I'm sure that many of my friends, those who are still alive, would say the same. And Sharp, the editor-in-chief of Charlie Hebdo, who died in the attack, said for many years, we hadn't any choice to defend freedom of press, because if Charlie Hebdo, a satirical newspaper known to mock all the religions, is not capable of showing drawings who are at the center of a worldwide polemic, we are not a newspaper anymore, and we are not Charlie Hebdo anymore. We just cannot continue our job after that. So after the terrorist attack, of course, it was really painful to see that the Jyllands-Posten, for example, didn't publish the cover of Charlie Hebdo following the attack. A very simple, sweet cover of Luz saying everything is forgiven, with a Mohammed crying. But at least, as you said, at least what personally I appreciated is at least the Jyllands-Posten didn't pretend to do it because it was the right thing to do, accusing Charlie Hebdo of provocation. it would have been difficult from the Yellen person, but still, they said we are too afraid. Some newspapers said it will cost too much in terms of security, which is a problem because in France, for example, the security of the newspaper, it's paid by the state because the state consider that it's part of freedom of speech, it's part of freedom of press, and the state should protect people who are brave enough to speak and inform. It's more than speak, to inform, to say to the people, look, this is, and again, the last cover of Charlie Hebdo during the trial of the murderers and their accomplices is just all of that for that. We have been killed for drawings. Do you realize that? And you need to see the drawings to realize this big gap between the emotion that leads to kill and the reality of what was those drawings. So my position on that is I understand that people are afraid. I accept that some take decision to not publish. As long as they explain that this way, we are honest with you, we are not doing completely our journalist job because we are too afraid and because we don't have any money anymore or not enough to protect ourselves, which I don't which I don't accept. And honestly, it still shocked me to the core. It's to read in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, or in many American media, lies, decontextualization, accusation, false accusation against newspaper like Charlie Hebdo, against France and secularism, just because they are coward enough or honestly now on the side of the people who are helping the fundamentalist propaganda by saying that this is pure, this is unnecessary provocation, this is racism, this is not acceptable. Coming from journalists, it's absolutely unacceptable. Before the terrorist attack that killed my friends, they could have said, we didn't realize that saying that Charlie Hebdo is Islamophobic by doing his job, publishing drawings would cost death threats worldwide. They could have been forgiven for not realizing what they were doing. But after the terrorist attack, no, sorry, I don't buy it anymore. And they continue to do it. Again, during the trial against the murderers of Charlie Hebdo, after the terrorist attack against Samuel Paty, the teacher in France.
Yes.
We endure a crazy, crazy campaign in the American media, crazy campaign of hate against France. And this time I can tell you, this is Francophobia at this level of craziness, lies, and again, dishonesty. I'm struck by the level of dishonesty of those journalists. Instead of saying, we disagree, we are too afraid, or we don't understand, okay, but no, they have to accuse the journalists who are still doing their job, knowing it can cost their lives.
Yeah, I was amazed by that as well. I thought it had the kind of moral imperialism about the way they were viewing France. And it was like, I think actually that for all the criticism I could have of Emmanuel Macron, I think the way separatism was drafted was intelligent. And I think he managed to draw a distinction between what should be accepted and what should not be accepted in your laïcité context that I thought was tolerant and I thought it was intelligent at the same time. And I could see from here that there was actually some thinking going into that. And he made, in my view, you know more about it than I do, but I think he made the right alliances. He got support from. So this was actually a very intelligent way of separating radicalism from reason basically in society. And the Americans, the liberal, the best papers in the world, Washington Post, New York Times, they could not distinguish between a Marine Le Pen position or an Emmanuel Macron position. Or even, I think actually she would be more intelligent than they would be. I understand if you feel absolutely outraged about that.
No, this is exactly what you said. They cannot distinguish anymore between a center leftist position and right wing, between Macron and Marine Le Pen, knowing that Macron is coming from a very tolerant background and he decided to draw a line very precisely to distinguish the radicals from the liberals inside the Muslim community and to avoid precisely the confusion between the fundamentalists and the other ones. But the problem is that that's my conclusion, is that some liberal American newspapers do not see the difference between the Muslim fundamentalists and the Muslim liberals. They have such an Orientalist, exotic view on those questions that they cannot see that there is extreme right guys on one end and leftist people on the other end. They would see it, of course, if it was American citizen from a Christian background, but they don't see it about Islam. They don't see that there is a struggle between the fundamentalists and the open-minded ones, and that they are helping actually the fundamentalists by saying that it is Islamophobic to defend secularism, to defend women's rights, because this is basically the purpose of this law against separatism, to defend social mixity, and also because they are thinking from a context that it is absolutely at the opposite of the European context. They are thinking from a continent where 90% of the terrorist attacks are coming from white supremacists. And the only big issue is about African Americans and is about police brutalities. Of course, we have police brutalities. We have racism in Europe too. But 90% of the terrorist attacks that are killing us are coming from Islamists. And we know also that we are on the rise of anti-Semitism. In France, for example, the majority of the hate crimes are not against Muslims. They are against Jews. The double of it. The double of hate crimes are against Jews than against Muslims because of the Islamists. I mean, the Islamists are bringing back anti-Semitism, sexism, homophobia, and separatism in many, many neighborhoods. Of course, we need to address this issue, because if we don't do it as Democrats, then Marine Le Pen will win the election. And this is precisely what Emmanuel Macron is trying to avoid, that Marine Le Pen and hate will win the next term, to avoid again a Trump. And as Americans are not so good at avoiding Trump, I think they should try the European way for once, and not the reverse, not the contrary.
You know, I often wonder whether in these years where I don't think I'm offending anyone by saying that politically and economically, France is not as strong as it used to be. You know, whether this Enlightenment tradition and the universalism of France, whether that culturally and philosophically will fade in the world because this nation is not as strong. But I doubt it. And when I think about that, then I'm very glad that you're there and that you've written this book and that you have all that you've done for the left and for free speech and for universalism. I'm really grateful for your effort, and you're a great inspiration for us here. And thank you so much for taking your time tonight and talking to us.
No, thank you so much. And no, really, it was a real pleasure. And it's always a real pleasure to see that we share so much in Europe. Honestly, I have brilliant conversation with people like you, with some journalists and intellectuals in Germany and all across Europe. And I think we really share this taste for complexity that can both help the left to survive and help us to not be completely colonized by simplification coming from the US. And yes, in France, we have a little expression saying, we don't have petrol, but we have ideas. Let's hope that ideas can still save the world.
Well, thank you so much for taking your time. I hope you'll have the time so we can come back to you later. Thank you so much, Caroline.
Thank you again.